Guys, Happy New Year. I think this year is gonna be something of novelty, something that's gonna be unique. Despite everything that's going on in the world, watchmaking is not dead or is not gonna die, despite everything that people say. Forget about the negative parts, we're gonna look into the positive parts with what's gonna happen, what and where are we going. I'm gonna put my bit of salt in the sauce, when whatever people say and whatever people think. I think it's a year where a lot of people are gonna try to innovate, and we're also gonna go towards something that's more casual than what I normally do. And hopefully everyone following the channel and everyone that supports the channel and the store are gonna like what we're doing and what I'm intending to do with the channel. So first video this year, we have a request from one of our followers. It's all about 90s and 2000 watches, and obviously it's something that's very actual today because they're becoming vintage. We're right at the border of the 25 years, which means, and it's a small technicality, but those watches are becoming vintage. So anything from 2000 or let's say 1999 and on are going to be vintage as of today, as of now. So I want to talk about the transition that happened from the 90s to the 2000s. I want to talk about certain models that are never going to go out of trend, and a lot of the companies, what they try to do, and where we're heading right now with the whole market. And I think that it has never been as challenging as today for, let's say, a real watch dealer, not the guys that are only selling Rolexes and Pateks. I don't call those guys real dealers. I'd say it's very challenging now to actually sell as many watches as today because there has been a lot done. And from today's perspective, a lot of what people are being interested in, and that's what I want to head into. So hang tight, there's a lot to talk about, and hope you like the video, guys. What I have today on my desk is not the most exciting stuff. I don't have a lot of watches from that era. I did an auction not too long ago, got rid of a lot of watches. A lot of new watches are coming in, vintage, modern, and here we have a bit of a mix from the 90s towards the 2000s and where the whole market was heading. And I find that the transition in the 90s was really weird in a way because certain guys were doing amazing things, independent watchmakers, and a lot of the other companies, including Rolex, Omega, even maybe Patek, except from the early 2000s, were just selling the boat. The economy was doing pretty well. People were spending money, so there was no reason to do any kind of innovation of some sort. So what we see is that, for example, we're gonna go with Cartier. Okay, in this case, this is a Cartier Octagon for ladies. It's a 24 millimeter. It's quite small. It's automatic, but they went from the model towards the Galbee model, which I have right here. So in terms of innovation, a lot of people are telling me I don't see the difference. And the funny thing is that when you're looking at the company's innovations, they're pretty subtle for a lot of people. A lot of people still tell me, is it a Galbee? Is it you can tell from the shape of the case and so many different little things. But overall, they were just selling the boat, okay? So they're trying to just keep on doing what was working, no real attempt to do something bigger, something different, something unique for the time, whereas independents from the time were doing some really cool stuff. There's still a lot of Breguet from the time, Blancpain, including even Dufour, and really cool stuff back then that was unique, that was going towards the tourbillon, that was really going towards that classic look that's going to be unique, that will go anywhere in any time from the 60s towards today, towards the future. It's really timeless in terms of design. Whereas when we're looking at the other models that we're looking at something that was done before, that was just an evolution of what was done in the past. Cartier was doing that. We have here Speedmaster, that's new old stock, it's on the website, it's from 1999. Super clean. Obviously, they were still selling that boat that was really pretty boring, The only thing that they really did, which I really don't like about the Speedmasters, and they kept it for roughly 20 years, is that they went from a very thin bracelet from the 3570, and then they went towards something a bit more chunky. I do believe that this clasp is pretty sturdy, but it's a bit too big. You know, if they would have made it maybe a bit slimmer, it would have been a lot better. So overall, a lot of companies were just trying to do what they were doing best, okay? They were using the same movements, they have been using the same suppliers, so you're going to find a lot of really mainstream watches in terms of movements. ATA, Valjoux, some of them including, we talked about Universal Genève back in the time, including Patek. They're using Le Mania movements, okay? So the Le Mania movements were highly prized and highly respected for their qualities. They had been making them for decades. ETA was still innovating in terms of designs, in terms of making them slimmer. They were always workhorses as well. So the 90s and the 2000s, people were trying to kind of find their own path in terms of what kind of movement they were going to use. Rolex had been using the 30 series, the 21 series, and that was pretty much it. They just went from, the 2000 is the marking point between tritium and luminova, and then super luminova. I'd say more than mid 90s to the 2000s. For example, Panerai began to be very, very active, so big watches started to be a trend. Again, it wasn't the biggest trend out there, but for a long time they kept on doing it. Now we see Panerais that are changing in terms of size, shape. What's cool back in the 90s as well is that we still had a lot of integrated bracelets. So we were talking about the Santos. Omega was doing something very similar, okay, but within their Constellation line. So those watches, in terms of design, they're pretty similar. They're pretty cool in terms of their almost integrated bezel. It's almost sunk in both cases. If you remove the bezel of a Santos, it's basically sinking in the case. But the Constellation ones, those are more flat. That's the early 90s. And then they came up with models that are a bit more bubbly like. So you're going to see a bezel that's a bit more rounded off. People like those a lot better than those flat bezels. What that translates to you guys is that the prices are much lower on those and they're much more affordable. They're still very good watches. They're quartz watches for the Omega, Santos as well as quartz. You do have a bit of both in both companies, despite the fact that those constellations from the 90s are mostly quartz. So you might have a chance of actually buying something that ticks a few boxes or all the boxes when you're looking at, integrated bracelets, affordability, serviceability. Quality for me is very important. After sale service for me is very important because I'm a second-hand dealer. I can service them. I can actually bring them back to life. And that's the problem that we were talking about a few videos before. A lot of people actually hated me for it, but it's okay. You just have to understand my point of view as a dealer. I'm always looking at, hey, can I actually buy a watch and bring them back to the market? When we do that, there's a whole process between buying, preparing the watch, taking pictures and everything, and bringing them back to the market. You don't see all of that. Backtracking to the idea is that there are a lot of really good companies out there that are still doing amazing things. Might it be Cartier, Omega, but let's get into something a bit more jewelry-like, okay, or something that's a bit more feminine. There was Ebel for a long time, and until the late 90s, as much as Rolex has used the El Primero movement. So you're going to have a lot of the watches from the 80s, the 90s are using the same movement as the Daytona. Yet Ebel doesn't have any kind of recognition about it. Even Zeniths from the 90s have very little, if not no, recognition for what they are. The company providing the movement for one of the best known watches in the world, the Rolex Daytona, everyone goes crazy when they see one, so for me it's a bit, it's like saying, hey, you know what, we don't care about Zenith. Who's Zenith? When that actually provided movements for amazing watches out there, including one of the most renowned watches on the planet, you know, and Daytona watches are extremely well known. We're not talking about the manual wound 72, which again we can go further down in the timeline, but if we're looking at the El Primero movement that was made by Zenith, it's reliable. I haven't seen one that wasn't working so far, and I've had tens of them so far. Might it be from different brands, might it be from the brand itself, might it be on Zenith Daytona, and they're never really broken. They're really sturdy. They're working at a very high frequency, 36,000 beats per hour. And when we're looking at that, we're looking at something that was made back in the late 60s. Okay, it was designed literally almost 60 years ago. When we're looking at something of that quality and we're translating that to Ebel or to other brands from the time from the 90s that were using the same movement, and those watches don't have a recognition because, you know, everyone talks about the same brands, the same models, and everything else. So we're talking of an era where innovation was not key. We were looking at stability. We're looking at something that could provide quality for a long time, and everyone was using the same movements back then. What that translates to for the customer was that a brand that was very publicized and that had a big budget would be put way in front of someone else that was using the same quality movement. And we're going to talk about that in a future video, and I hope you guys are going to follow that as well. The 90s and the 2000s are offering great quality in terms of stability, in terms of, you know, trends that were working very well for a very long time, and also the fact that you're actually able to service those movements for the next decades or maybe for the next century, because they're still making a lot of those parts and a lot of those movement parts for those watches. And for me, it's something very interesting because it's going to be an era of something that was so good in terms of quality that innovation was not so important. We're going to see it with Rolex, with Patek, where Patek until 1999, 2000, they were still using the Mania base movement and modifying it, okay? Patek's own chronograph movement started in the mid 2000s. So before that, they were sourcing movements and parts elsewhere, okay? It's not like, for example, Longines that created their own 33 movement, I believe, and it was the early 1913, 1915, something around there. So we're looking at companies that were basically sailing the same waves forever. And sorry to repeat myself, but this is what it was, and was working very well. Their companies were working pretty well, but the value for the customer was just not there anymore at some point. Because if you keep on raising the price and still using the same movements, you're just basically creating a case, creating a bezel, creating a dial, different set of hands, and you're just being a marketer of objects. In a way, it's good because, again, as I said, the longevity of those watches are on a very long term. In terms of uniqueness, you don't have anything more special in a, I don't know, in an Omega or in a Sin. If you're looking in different watches, you have the same movements. What makes the watch more valuable other than, you know, the looks and the brand and, you know, the service and the publicity and everything? So for me, you can get amazing watches, sub 2000, sub $3,000 watches that have iconic movements like the El Primero and that are not actually costing you a fortune, or they're costing you the price of actually an entry-level luxury watch right now. And in reality, this whole market has been a tie-up of different companies working together, and that's what was making this whole industry very cohesive and very solid for a very long time. Nowadays, with the market being controlled basically by 4, 5, 6, 10 brands that we see all the time are basically taking maybe 80 to 90% of the market, that actually creates a dystopia between some really good brands that are of quality and really affordable because people don't want them because they're not publicized. And then you have on the other side, you have Rolex, Omega, Patek, and even Vacheron is having pretty much a hard time right now versus other brands just because they're still using in certain cases even Le Mania movements. I had the chronographs, which is an amazing watch, but knowing that it's a Le Mania movement and they're selling it for roughly $60,000, I think, with the taxes, or even more in Canadian funds, I find it outrageous to actually say, hey, we're marketing a manual wound movement, but it's not even ours for such big amount. For me, it's a bit of a shock. Okay, so despite the fact that the case was amazing, dial, everything that was cool about that watch is not talking to me personally in terms of quality versus price, and that's what I always talk about. Quality has a price, but at each level of a price you have enough quality that you can say, okay, well, this actually gives me enough quality for that price that I'm going to be happy with and about for a very long time. What I think is the quality right now has to reflect the time that people put, okay, because we're talking about manufacturing watches and about, putting, I don't know, tens, if not thousands of hours, if we're looking from tens of hours and, maybe a Rolex, maybe we're looking at thousands of hours into a very high-end watch. And for me, that's worth money because someone put his energy. If it's something made by a machine, we're just saying, hey, we're selling you a design with something that can be made, we can make 10,000 of them a day. I don't find that a quality piece just because it's made by a machine. So I find that there's something more romantic about being a human being behind the making of a watch. That's what a watch should be. If we're using a computer, might as well use your cell phone and call it a day, and then you have the time, the perfect time, all the time on your wrist. Okay, so there's that perfect balance between price, quality, and what the customer gets. And including myself, I'm also a consumer, I'm also a collector. Therefore, it just speaks to me to say, hey, you know what, I have something unique, I have something handmade, and there's 500 pieces made a year or 1,000 pieces made a year. And I find that this is where the market should be going in the next 5-10 years. Even this year, I think that a lot of companies deserve a lot more credit for what they're doing. It's not only buying and selling watches, it's also what people present as a company to their customers. And a lot of people just realize that after so many years of purchasing the same type of product. I see customers here all the time. We're revolving around the same bush, the same Datejusts, the same subs, the same Omegas, and so on and so forth. I mean, like, yeah, that's cool, but I can't have only that in my inventory. It would be like so boring, which gets to the point of saying, you know what, I want to do better in terms of bringing back some other brands that no one knows about. I find that, if we're looking at Teddy Belisar, he's doing an amazing job talking about smaller brands that are doing amazing for themselves. He's also promoting companies that he's not necessarily affiliated to, which I have a lot of respect for. And that's what everything should do right now. It shouldn't be only, okay, well, I'm doing this for the money. It doesn't really matter. It's not as important when we're actually right now creating a total unbalance in the field of watches and people looking only at Rolexes. I cannot sell only Rolexes. It would be the most boring thing in my life to do. Whereas the new watches, 2000 and the earlier models, are really interesting. Okay, we're looking at brands that are doing very well for themselves and of great price and quality. And I think that if you guys are looking for those, you can look on Chrono24, you can look on eBay, on different forums, and you're gonna find amazing watches that basically no one wants, but they have such a good history and such a good background in terms of quality, in terms of everything else. So I think you should look into it. Buy a few books, buy books from the early to the late 90s, the early 2000s. You're going to see a lot of people doing different innovations in terms of looks, but the core of the movements were the same. Therefore, you can have a bigger watch with the same movement as a smaller one, but you're going to have something different on the wrist for a heavily discounted price. When I do auctions, sometimes the least known brands are doing the worst in my auctions just because people are just not looking at them they're just not so interested by them. And in terms of the long term, I think that those are the watches that are really interesting to collect, because no one is paying attention to them right now. And my last point is, for example, I have one here, and this watch was just melted. Okay, it's a Baume & Mercier. And when we're talking value, okay, a lot of people come to me and they're like, hey, Chris, I have this 1990s solid gold watch, or early 2000s. And I'm like, well, what do you pay for it back then? Oh, I paid $2,500, which was a lot of money back then. I'm like, yeah, well, back then, the ounce of gold was, I think, $180, $200 US an ounce, depending on the years, depending on the fluctuations. And now we're roughly at 2,500, 2,400, something around there. What that translates to is that your watch has actually gained value, but not because of the watch, but because of the gold. Gold watches have been melted for decades, okay? They stopped working, people didn't want to repair them. Local watchmakers were saying, you know what, we're going to put a quartz movement instead of an automatic movement in that thing. And that becomes a watch that's basically destroyed, or that's very hard to actually repair, and we're melting them. Right now there's a huge excitement about those gold watches. The value of gold is always more interesting for jewelers, and it's sad, but it's the reality of the market, where you have a watch, for example, the Baume & Mercier, there was roughly $2,700 of gold, more or less. You're looking at a $2,000 US watch. If I'm trying to actually fix it, okay, putting a few $100, $200-300 in the service, then we're looking at a new band, let's say another few $100, okay? And we're gonna market the watch, let's put it this way, 3,500 Canadian. How much is my margin? How much can I really make after adding almost $400 or $500 into the servicing, custom-made strap, and then we have to list it, and then we have to sell it, we have fees, and so on and so forth. The problem is with those watches right now is that a lot of dealers, including myself, are going to be melting them. And that becomes very sad for the market, but their counterparts in stainless sometimes are worth a few $100, including even this Baume & Mercier. I think it's a Classimo or whatever it was. But this is what it has become. Those 90s watches were really interesting in terms of the fact they were very classic. They're solid gold. They have, including this one, I think it's an ETA movement, very well made. But on the long term, people are gonna cry knowing that we have to melt their watches. This is what it has become in the past, 3 to 5 years, more than ever, unless, again, we're talking of watches that are from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, including the 90s, that have special dials, that have special designs, unless you really have something special in your hands. And it saddens me to actually say this, but there are watches that are being melted daily, especially from the 90s, the early 2000s, because the gold was so low. And today, especially if you have an integrated bracelet or something very heavy, we're not looking at watches that are gonna be very valuable overall. And I hope you guys understand that the 90s and the 2000s were, were a time where we're never gonna go back. Watches of that era are pretty affordable. If we're looking, for example, right here, this is the Planet Ocean Casino Royale. It does have the 007 on the hand. It's a limited edition of 5,007 pieces. It's okay. It's from the, I think 2007, 2008. Pretty cool watch. I'll have it on the website shortly. What's cool about this thing is that it's very sturdy. It does have a coaxial movement, but it's actually a modified movement by Omega. So it does have the escapement. And that's when I was saying that they were selling the boat, is that they were using basically a regular off-the-shelf movement, modifying it in terms of the escapement, but otherwise it just remains about 85 to 95% of it is basically an ETA movement, including wheels, including most probably even the automatic part. It's pretty much all the same. Problem is, is that those watches kept on going up in value. So as I said earlier, it's really cool to actually have a watch that's limited, that has a little hand that's a bit different, but by no means is it different other than the case back and the little hand other than the regular one. So that's something that Omega did for many years, that they actually made a lot of money on, and actually people get excited about it. I don't. Okay, limited editions or not, it is the same watch as the regular one except a few little things. In the vintage world it's a bit different. I'd say making 5,000 of those isn't by no means or in any way rare. Okay, if we compare it to Laurent Ferrier, who made less than, I think, 3,500 watches in 15 years. If you're making 5,007 of the same watches in 1 year alone for one brand, it's by no means rare, okay? It's really cool. Yeah, it's a bit more rare than the regular ones, but some people might give it more value, some people won't. I'd say yes, it's a bit more valuable, but not to the extent of saying, hey, you know what, I have a unique watch. And anyway, okay, so this is something cool. Rolex they had a lot of really cool stuff happening. So late 90s, early 2000s, the bracelets have changed. For Rolex, it's a big thing. Then you had tritium going towards luminova, so that meant that your luminous material would be actually remaining luminous for maybe 20, 30, 40 minutes and still very visible. You turn off the lights and it's still very bright. That was a huge advancement versus the tritium counterpart that was basically lasting maybe a few minutes. It's a bit of a different approach, and I find that Rolex was doing a few little things that were pretty interesting. Also in 2005, 2006, they went from their classic, flip clasp to a hidden clasp on Datejusts. They did solid end links on their sports models. Quite a few little things that were really interesting and actually made them and showcased what they were able to do in terms of quality. And Rolex, I think, was always the king of proportions. I wouldn't call them the king of watches, even though they sell, in terms of values, they sell more than anyone else. But in terms of proportions, I think their watches are really good. They do fit well. Smaller, taller people, you're a bit bigger, you're training, you can wear a Rolex, from every single perspective. A Rolex sub is not going to look bad on a smaller guy, and it's not going to look bad on a bigger guy, Obviously, there's preferences in sizes, but overall I think Rolex was doing something, that is themselves, that is just respectful of the brand overall. And I'd say if you do have any more questions about the 90s, I'm here to answer them. It's my perspective, my take on what was happening back then. I do see a lot of brands that were obviously very, very hit. In today's market, we almost never see them just because a lot of people are just not paying attention to those brands anymore. The publicity is very limited, and it's almost becoming an idea of if you know, you know type of thing. And it shouldn't be that. A lot of people were reading books and were just interested by different brands and different models. So I'd say instead of actually just reading Hodinkee, who is basically paid to do publicity for brands, go around, come to stores like mine, go wherever you go, and try to ask people if they have something different, if they have something unique, and you might have something that's, I'd say, 10 times better in terms of price versus quality than regular Rolex. You might even have like a little Omega that doesn't look like anything from afar, but then if you look into the details, you might have a special movement, you might have a unique dial. You can find something unique that's overlooked in today's market just because people are just not curious enough, and just because the publicity that we see today is not reflective of what was done before, especially those past 25 years. And the 90s are just so much more interesting because of those little intricacies that we just don't see because we're being flooded with the regular stuff. I hope you liked the video. If you do have more questions, again, don't be shy, subscribe. I'm gonna share with you what I can. Happy New Year, guys. Lots of health, lots of love. I'll actually see you in the next video. Thank you, guys. Enjoy.